I used a simple sculpting technique to make these characters actually interact with each other, and here's how you can use it for more than just characters in your own projects. All you need to begin is 2 objects. The easiest example that I could come up with is a sphere and a plane. The sphere is supposed to react to the plane. So now let's grab the sphere and we can pull it down so that it basically clips into the plane. This basically decides how soft the sphere is. And then we can go to the object data properties of the sphere and use the shape keys. Let's click plus twice, set the value to 1, and then we can go into sculpt mode. We can now just use the draw brush, and then we can move the part of the sphere that is clipping through the surface of the plane back up again by holding Control and just moving it up basically until there's nothing underneath the plane. And we can see it already looks like it's interacting with the plane. But the cool thing about shape keys is shape keys basically save changes in the base geometry of an object in these layers. So if I set the value now down from 1 to 0, you can see the sphere went back to its original shape. So this way we can save changes in the object without actually having to destructively change the shape. If you want to make the sphere even softer, what we could do now is we could, for example, we can say that the weight of the ball would kind of push onto the surface even more so that it's not fully round at the top anymore. And then it probably also would kind of spread apart a little bit more. So we could, for example, use the draw brush again and just kind of push it outwards a little bit, just basically where it's connecting with the surface. Of course, if it ever clips through the surface again, we can bring it back up again. And that's what it would look like. Now let's make it a little bit more interesting. We have the slope now, so let's do the same again. Shape key 1 and 2, value to 1. Always make sure that the value is at 1, otherwise it doesn't get saved. And then we can go to scope mode, and we need to go inside of the object, because otherwise we can't really see where it's clipping through the surface. But of course we want to make the sphere this time a little softer. We can see it already reacts to it, but I want to make it even floppier so that it not only reacts by deforming, but it also spreads out more because the surface tension isn't as strong, so it kind of stretches more like a water balloon basically. We could once again use the draw brush, for example, and just kind of move it in all directions again. Or you could also use the grab brush for this and then spreading it out like this. The way you want to do it is kind of on you. I don't want to judge, okay? You could do it however you like. It doesn't even have to be 100% symmetrical. You know, it kind of always depends on what kind of object you're working with. Water balloons are probably not going to be symmetrical at all. And then to make it even more visible that the weight is sort of pushing down, we would go to the top again and make it flatter so that the shape at the top isn't fully there anymore. And then we can already see it looks way more like a water balloon sitting on this little ridge right here. Of course, then we can probably already see that it's once again poking through or clipping through the surface. Go in here once again and push it up. But of course, if you want to add more detail to this now, a simple shape key will not be enough. We can add more detail now by going to the modify properties and adding a multi-resolution modifier. Now we go in here and we use the subdivide button, and this basically subdivides the mesh, but it also saves the changes that we now do in this multi-resolution modifier. So for example, if I move this up like this, and then I disable the multi-resolution modifier, you can see it goes back to its original shape, which means now we have more geometry and we can go in here and we can add even more detail to, for example, here the border would probably kind of the weight would push down onto the surface and it would kind of, bump or whatever against the surface of the slope. Make sure that the gap between the two objects is as close as possible. So keep the objects as close as possible, but make sure that you don't see that they sort of, clip into each other. And then once we've done that, we can go in here again and we can smooth it a little bit so that so that the weight looks like it's pushing down even more and spreading out even more. And then, as you can see, we can bring this fully back to its original shape by just removing the multi-resolution modifier as well as the shape key. And there you go, we're back to its original shape. Going back to the original 2 characters, let's now make his hand interact with her butt. I would recommend starting with a shape key if the indentation, I guess you could call it, is very deep. So if these fingers would be even deeper or clipping even more into her surface, I would recommend starting with a shape key, but here it's quite subtle, so we don't need to begin with a shape key. We can immediately go to the multi-resolution modifier. And as you can see, I already have 3 levels applied. I would always recommend starting with the first layer and then going deeper and deeper if you need more detail. So going back to sculpt layer 1, and then we can go into sculpt mode, and we begin by, for example, using the draw brush. His finger would press against the surface, so the surface of her finger would deform. So we basically just dig out his fingers like this. I use the draw brush. Of course, what brush you use is kind of up to you. I guess you could also use the snake hook brush, whatever brush you want to use. We kind of want to fully expose his finger, or as much as we can. If we don't have enough geometry to fully expose his finger, we can add more layers of subdivision. One thing to keep in mind again is to keep the surface as close as possible to the fingers. And the way you can do that, in my opinion, the easiest way is just to go inside of the character's body. This way you can see where the fingers are actually still clipping into the surface. And then you can, for example, use the draw brush, hold control to grab the surface and bring it further away from the finger so that the finger is not clipping anymore. Like this. And then of course we can see here his whole hand is actually still inside. So we need to bring this out as well. As you can see, the geometry is quite low here, so we probably can't fully bring everything out. So now we can go and add more multi-resolution steps. But one thing to keep in mind is for every object, there's a volume preservation if the object isn't open. So for example, for her butt or even for the ball that we had before, the volume of the object doesn't change. Only the shape of the object changes. Even though the ball might bend in different ways or deform in different ways, the amount of volume inside of that ball will always stay the same. So for example, here, if he presses with his hand against her butt, we need to make sure that the surrounding surface that is not being pressed against kind of gets a little bit more volume. The way we can do that is, we can just use the draw brush again, and we can add a little bit more volume here, for example, around this area, just a little bit more. Maybe even around his fingers, and probably also here in the middle. This really gives it this look of squeezing or kind of pressing together. I don't want to make it too strong because the surface of her skin is still quite stiff, but a little bit helps here, for example, over here. As you can see right there, that's what I mean. Now let's go in here and increase the resolution level so that we have more geometry that we can work with. And we can go in again. And what we could, for example, do now is we could use the inflate brush to bring the skin back to the finger again, just so that we can be a little bit more exact with how close we can get to the finger. We can bring it a little closer by, for example, using the inflate brush. As you can see now, the shadows get closer to the finger. We can go back into the object, use the draw brush again, just to bring the fingers back out again. Of course, this might be quite deep. And of course, we always have to keep in mind the surface tension. Here, for example, we would probably want to smooth it out a little bit because the tension of her skin is quite stiff. And then we can see we already have a pretty good looking interaction between him and her. One more thing I want to put your attention to, and that is what we can see here. That is basically surface tension. So for example, if you grab your wrist and then you twist it, you can see the fingers and the wrist skin have tension with another, which means that they not only deform the surface by grabbing it, but they also can move it around a little bit. That is what we can see here. This finger, for example, here, his thumb presses against her waist, but it also pushes forward, which means it not only deforms inwards, but it also pulls the surface a little bit with it, I guess, which creates this elongated or distorted deformation. This technique is super simple and super useful to make your sculpts look way more realistic, and you can even use it for more than just your characters. Another good example where you can use it is for clothing. Here, for example, for her underwear, if the underwear is pretty tight, for example, around the waist, what we could do is we could go in here and we could add some indentation here as well. We can see if it's kind of breaking through, for example, over here, and then we grab the draw brush again and just kind of dig it out again to add just a very, very slight indentation over here, for example. And then we can see the comparison between here and over here. It immediately looks more realistic. Of course, you can probably bring it a little closer, but of course that is now the, fine tuning that you can do for yourself. Or it can also be the same character. Here, for example, she's using her arm to push her breast a little bit further upwards so that it kind of gets deformed inwards. Also because of the bra, of course, it kind of gets deformed inwards as well. That is also one more thing that I want to kind of highlight for if you want to create characters, for example, female characters. What I have always struggled with is the decision whether or not I want to sculpt the boobs so that they immediately look like they deform to the bra that isn't there yet, or if I want to sculpt them naturally first in their natural shape, and then I want to change the shape afterwards so that they look like they're being pressed together by the bra, for example. So make sure that if you sculpt characters with, for example, naturally shaped breasts, that once you add the outfit, you reshape the breasts so that they look like they're actually being deformed by the bra that is then part of the outfit. And then one more thing to keep in mind is that, of course, the softness can also change between different areas of the object. For example, for the body, where the bones are far away, it's quite soft, for example, like the butt. But if we go to the waist, for example, or the rib cage, the bones are very close to the surface, which means that these areas are a little bit less deformable, I guess. There's still slight deformation, but it's not as extreme as, for example, for the legs, the butt, basically everywhere where you have like big muscles. For example, the arm as well, the biceps, are areas where you can deform quite a lot. In my opinion, it's quite a simple technique to add way more realism to your object, to your scene, whatever you're doing, whether it's characters or something else. And if you have any more questions, make sure to put them in the comments. Thanks for watching. Maybe I'll see you next time. See ya.